Wow. What an episode we have for you today. This was a conversation about how we as individuals, as entrepreneurs, as business leaders have accountability for the sustainability of our planet, something that we can tangibly influence through the choices that we make. My guest today is Christian Smith. Christian has been in the sustainability field for about 15 years and has held positions at major retailers, fashion brands, and in the NGO sector. By his own admittance, he's had quite a nomadic existence. Born in the UK, he's lived in Freetown, London, Lyon, Hamburg, Mikicho, Washington, DC, Brasilia, New York, and now flitters between Amsterdam and Berlin. Taking his time to figure out what he wanted to do, Christian has dabbled in recruitment, energy research, sales, English language teaching, stay-at-home parenting, until he fully immersed himself into his MSc in Environment and Sustainable Development from UCL, and has never really looked back since then. He's currently head of sustainability, diversity, inclusion, reporting, and stakeholder engagement at Zalando, where his role is to connect the organization with the outside world as they navigate the ever-changing world of sustainability. This is a tale of curiosity, purpose, and how to find your inner calling by listening to your thoughts and putting them into action. I started this episode with a big question, thinking we'd back shuffle to some simpler topics at a later point in the episode, but we just kept on going deeper and deeper and deeper. By the end of this conversation, I left with a renewed sense of optimism and urgency to assess my day-to-day actions and choices based on their wider or longer-term impact. You're going to enjoy this wake up and cold water in the face episode for sure. Have fun in there. Christian, so lovely to have you on the show. We've known each other ever since we're at uni together, and my have times changed since then. And even as students, we'd get together, we'd contemplate the world, what was working, what was downright broken. Most of that would have been forgotten the next day for reasons we won't mention. And the point being that robust conversation has never been a stranger to us, and we've always valued that about our friendship, I think. And in our work lives, actually from the start of our careers, neither of us really found a natural fit straight away. And after a bit of meandering and figuring out, we soon got used to the fact that we would need to pivot, need to change, need to try things out frequently and effortlessly if we were to succeed and find something that felt a little bit better. I think despite that, our careers took different turns, mine from advertising and marketing and into business and product innovation, experience design, and yours was very much geared up around purpose from what I can observe. So you were swimming upstream when a lot of people hadn't really woken up to the rather large topic of sustainability and all things good. And I'm in awe of that, and actually what you've been able to achieve through just sheer persistence, mainly against the institution of corporates and probably against all odds as well. So a lot of mentors and coaches will ask, what were you put on the planet to do? So maybe we could start with the question around that. What do you feel like your comfort zone is? That's a nice, easy one. How do you define yourself and your purpose for those that don't know you?
Thanks for the intro. How do I define myself and my purpose? You mentioned our chats. So we've had lots and lots of chats for 20 something years now, and it's always trying to figure out what the hell am I here to do? And there was never this feeling that I wanted to be a director of a bank or a lawyer or this. There was never that kind of drive to be something that with that level of status. But I think what happened is the fact that I was able to travel quite a lot as a child and also as an adult. We knew each other at UCL, but obviously I grew up in West Africa. I was born in London. I grew up in West Africa in Sierra Leone. And that probably had much more of an impact on me than I realized. And then throughout the last 20 years or so since leaving university, I've lived in Brazil, in Japan, had a stint in the US. That combined with France and Germany, where you and I were obviously lived in Hamburg, led me to the belief that this world in which we live, this wonderful place in which we live, is in a bit of a mess. And so there was always something about me of what can you do? And this isn't like I want to save the world thing. Is how can we improve things? How can we value the things that make us what we are? The things that the ecosystem in which we live that serves us so well. And what can I do? How can I use my role, my knowledge, my education, my experiences to bring that to the fore? And it was a very long journey trying to figure out what that was. I dabbled in a lot of things, as you mentioned. I did recruitment. I did sales. I did work for a Japanese energy company. I've done all sorts of things. But when I look back, and it's easy to have that 2020 vision, but when I look back, it feels very clear to me that it was through that meandering journey that I landed where I am. I had to make those decisions. I had to make that trip to land on something. And that something is sustainability. It's the opportunity to look at the world as it might be and try to pivot, whether it's companies, individuals, NGOs, whatever it might be, into that space and try to remain hopeful. So I guess when we look at my purpose is to maintain the level of hope that we might come out of all the different shitstorms that we're facing right now in a better place. And my role is to work with organizations, individuals to try to bring that to life.
Well, you answered that much better than I thought you would. But anyway, no, it's a very good answer. In just thinking about that, obviously travel and multicultural and diversity, all of the different elements of inputs that you've had over your lifetime. And thinking back to that, obviously travel is a great way to put perspective on things. You're often seeing people in lesser situations or less comfortable situations than you would be yourself. And I think that perspective obviously puts a lens on how you appreciate things in your current state, in your current realm, where you are today. What you end up doing is obviously informed by that, and it influences people a lot. But a lot of people don't see that, right? So how do you share that with other people? Because it really comes down to perspective. But if people don't get it, then they're just stuck in their own ways.
Yeah, I think a really key component of that for me is it's the realization, because I spent my nascent years in Sierra Leone in Freetown, and I look at what could have been. It's just, you think of those sliding doors moments. If my father hadn't succeeded the way that he had, then I could be living in Freetown somewhere trying to, not having running water. Really, really kind of fundamental shift in what my life could have been. And so that aspect was always drilled into me as a kid. See how fortunate you are. And I didn't have to think about it. I saw it. And in continuing, I left Sierra Leone when I was 7, 8 years old, but we used to go back every year. So there was always a reminder of where we came from, what my father had achieved in order to get us to where we were able to have a really comfortable life and to be able to travel and to benefit from these things. What I try to do is just really connect people to that fact. It's only been relatively recently that I've been able to be very open and honest about these topics as well. You mentioned diversity and inclusion. And obviously, as a Black man growing up in the UK, I have been subjected to my fair amount of racism, but it was never something you could speak about growing up. It was always like, well, just deal with it. Even from my parents' standpoint, it's, well, you're a Black man. I remember my father's like, you are a Black man. You will have to work twice as hard to get half as far. That's one of the things he drilled in me at a very early age. So it was like, just put your head down and get on with it. But now being in a space where you are able to be more transparent, you are able to be more open, you are able to bring these different perspectives to the table, not as a kind of tokenistic approach, but as a way to provide perspective. I think increasingly people are valuing that. And it's important for me to be vocal about it, because I think we spoke about this before, there's a kind of weird juxtaposition with me as well. When I open my mouth and I speak, it might not necessarily be the things that people are expected to hear. But then when I speak, it takes people to a different place. And so I have to bring people back and say, actually, hold on. This is what my background is. This is where I'm from. These are the experiences that I've had. And just because I speak in a certain way doesn't mean that I haven't had to experience some of the pitfalls, some of the challenges that Black people of color have had to face throughout history. It may be different now. It may be slightly less. We may be slightly more in tune to some of these topics, but they are still there. They're still relevant, and they're still things that we need to address. So my thing right now is being in a position where people listen to me, which I also find a bit funny, but people listen to what I have to say, means that I am even more confident to stand up for myself, for what is right, and for other people. So it's something that I think that I bring to the table as well. So that perspective from travel, that perspective of seeing the world, whether it's Freetown, whether it's the travels we had in Brazil, in Rio and in Brasilia, some of the situations I was in Japan as well, because I think people's perceptions of Japan is very different from the reality. And bringing those things to the table and being able to say, hey, you know what? We do have an effect from the choice that we make here in the world in which we live, whether you're in Berlin or Amsterdam or London, we do have an impact. And the choice that we make can actually ameliorate people's lives. So let's figure out how to put that into practice.
Yeah, I think interesting points in and around what drives people to make change possible, and probably around the choices that people think that they have. When they listen to what you've just described, people might think, okay, somebody's chosen to do that as their career. That's all they live for, and this is what they're here to do. A lot of people that are in different walks of life and probably in different careers and maybe in different situations will maybe not know where to start in relation to their own choices and in relation to what can be done at a very personal level to them but in a way that would be impactful for the broader culture or the broader society that they live in. So do you feel like everyone has a role to play? I'm sure I know the answer to this a little bit, but what's your perspective on that?
I think everyone can play a role should they want to, but I also don't want to be the person that forces people to do so. And I think I was just listening to one of the previous podcasts and they were talking about persuasion. It's my job to come to the table and help people to understand what's in it for them. This is, I think, one of the biggest lessons I've learned the last 10, 12, 13 years of doing this type of work is that I may come from this place, this kind of idealistic perspective of what the world could be, with my ideas on, human rights and environmental topics and whatever it might be. But for a lot of people, they come in at very different angles. So it's not really my role to come in and say, hey, you have to do this because it's great for the environment or for whatever. It's my role to figure out an entry point and meet them halfway, sometimes 3/4 of the way. So it's really important for me to take my knowledge, my understanding of the world, my way of thinking from a systemic perspective and bring that down to the things that people value so that they can make the decisions according to the KPIs that matter to them. So I'm not going to force anyone to go, you have to go on this trip with me. I'm not going to guilt trip people into it. If you yourself aren't touched by the way that the world has changed, whether it's the increasing levels of inequality, whether it's the unpredictable weather and the effect on food and migration, for example, if that doesn't affect you, then it's my job to come to you with the right amount of information to say, okay, fine, let's not talk about migration. Let's not talk about agriculture. Let's talk about KPIs. Let's talk about risk. Let's talk about all these different topics and let me find a way to bring you to the conversation. And that also helps me because it helps me to understand, again, the depth of the value system that we're in and take away some of my naivety about how people should just change and really start working with people where they are.
Yeah, I'd imagine starting out in your line of work, that there would have been a degree of frustration in how some of those messages were received to begin with, but also in trying to establish how that gap could be plugged in some way, because you're effectively evangelizing and you're expecting people to come on the journey with you, and not everyone's ready for that. And you have to meet them where they're at and obviously move them along. But it must be extremely tiring.
It has been. But I guess one of the things someone said to me a while ago is that I do have this kind of steely determination, which I never thought of for myself. It's like, I will play the long game. And so for me, it's always been maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually it'll happen. You'll be able to see. And that level of patience has been really, really important for me and my sanity, because experience, again, is the thing that really is valuable for me here. When I was starting out, I knew very little about how business worked. I needed to have these experiences to learn how to navigate the landscape, how to deal with people who work in logistics versus people who work in finance versus people who work in the supply chain. What are the competencies they have? What are the things that are important to them? And then how do you then take the things that we in the sustainability world need to move the needle on and broach the subject in the right way? What I think has happened over time, though, and you mentioned this as well, is that, we were very much on the fringes of things. And I say this as someone who came in, relatively late in a way, because when I look at the documents that written about the Club of Rome, the Donella Meadows who wrote Thinking in Systems and things like that, this is the 70s. When you look at the knowledge that oil companies had about climate change and things like that, that's going back to the 50s, something like that. It's ridiculous. So you think that I was an early adopter. I came in pretty late. Everyone is just even more late. So I think about that, and I think about the fact that there is an exponential increase in the amount of people who are aware of what's going on, and that continues to drive certain behaviors, certain actions. On top of that, the political climate has really caught up as well. When you look at the Infrastructure Act over in the US, that was essentially a climate act. Whether or not it's successful or not, that's going to be another question. But that was essentially to do with climate change. When you look at the European perspective, you look at the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, you look at all the regulations requiring better communication of environmental impacts, better understanding of environmental impacts. These things have caught up to the point where I don't have to necessarily evangelize anymore, because regardless of where we are going as an organization, where you might want to go as an organization, you are now going to be required to actually put these things into practice, measure your CO2 footprint, measure the impact you have on your supply chain, and report on it. When you report on it, people are going to take note. And if you're not improving, people will come back at you and ask you why. So it's been a really interesting challenge. What changed in my challenge? So first of all, it was trying to bring people into the conversation to evangelize. Then it was, okay, you can't evangelize, so you have to meet people halfway. And now my conversation's changed again, which is we have to do this. Let me help you understand what this means and how we can then use this as a way to take our business forward. What can we leverage in these changes that helps us to stay ahead of the game or just not get into trouble? And I think some of those conversations have changed. Your access to leaders across the business changes because of the way legislation has changed. But it also makes my life in one way a lot easier because I don't have to be so emotionally vested now. I can use much more of my rational mind and bring people on for the journey. But it also provides new challenges of how do you then engage with people across the business to turn this into a meaningful exercise rather than something that is just very much a tick boxy approach to what's going on.
There's a lot to think about there. There's obviously the broader change at play that people are aware of to a greater or lesser degree. The rate of change has improved and increased, obviously. So the velocity at which change is happening and the expected response to that is obviously shrinking. Technology is driving that. It feels like you can see other things play out in other areas that have been successful, really, in driving the level of change because the new bar has been set and people have been expected to meet that bar and meet that expectation. So if you think about the world of data and the rollout of GDPR, for example, that was not an easy thing for a lot of people to get their heads around, but there was education that happened. Some of the industry leaders came forward, put a lot of things forward. They were able to educate their businesses and their clients in and around what needed to happen. And all of a sudden, fast forwarding a few years, that feels like it was accepted and the change was made, right? But until that bar is really set in a way that people's ears prick and they actually feel like they need to respond to, either personally or on behalf of their organization, it feels like everyone's just going to carry on as usual. And that level of inertia is just still there. So there's a lot of talk, obviously, around reversing the effects of CO2 emissions and net zero and everything else. The fact that we would need to do something just unprecedented and have a concerted effort in the next 7 to 9 years around whatever would need to be done. We don't know what the answer is yet, but let's get AI involved and maybe we can fix it in some way. Get the machines to do it. Yeah, I just wonder, like, what will be the next kind of big frontier and the big line that the people need to cross and actually pay attention to and personally act upon, do you believe?
And this kind of comes back to my evangelizing thing and the idealism that still runs in my head after studying way too much at UCL. For me, the biggest change that we could possibly make right now is addressing the financial system. Everything in this world is about money. Regardless of what you might want to say, it is about money. And the challenges that we're facing right now is that we have reached this level of development as a society because we're all chasing money, better lives, more access, better technology, improvements in all over the place. I mean, the world is in many ways a better place now. Poverty levels have dropped. People's access to clean water, to things like sewage treatment, all these different fundamental things have increased. And that was driven by this growth mindset that we've had as part of underpinning the system. What we can't do anymore, or what we shouldn't do anymore, is sit down and say, okay, well, how can we just grow and grow? And so the big question now, which people really are having issues trying to address, because this then becomes a question of semantics as well, is how do we decouple economic growth from material growth? So the challenge here is not to say that we can't grow anymore from an economic perspective, but that growth should not be dependent on the extraction of resources from the ecosystem, from the biosphere. We need to restore, not extract. And if we use clothing as an example, just reading some of the stats the other day, we have enough material out there right now to actually, if we develop the right systems in terms of circularity, to keep on producing clothing without ever having to get another cotton plant grown in water-stressed areas. So the key thing for me now is how can we start to challenge politicians and the investor community in particular to reward companies for the behaviors that are needed to avert the worst cases of climate change. My mind now is that we're way past the point of no return. Everything I read, everything I understand about it is that what we are doing is mitigating. We're not going to stop. We're not going to reverse, but we're mitigating. We're trying to avoid the worst possible outcomes. And if you see already the impact of the weather systems, of the changes in climate that are happening, we do not want it to get any worse. I mean, from a personal perspective, when I talk to my family in Sierra Leone and we talk about the rain season, it's absolutely ridiculous. And that's changed over a period of time. And that is due to climate change. So what we're trying to do is avert the worst cases. And in order to do so, we need to be able to turn around and say, well, if industrialization is responsible for a large amount of CO2 emissions, then how do we deindustrialize in a way that reduces our reliance on CO2 emitting activities, and at the same time create new areas for growth and new ways of measuring how successful a company is? It doesn't just become this zero-sum game of you either make money or lose money. It's how can you contribute to society at large in a way that provides benefits, not just for you and your bottom line, but for the communities and areas and that you affect, so that people can thrive rather than be a recipient of the waste of what you produce. So I think that challenge for me is now the key thing, is that how do we then turn towards politicians, towards investors, and find a way to share this message? Because we are all tied into the system that has, yes, worked for a long time, but now, as I'm sure you're aware of as well, and many of your friends be aware of, doesn't serve everyone. It serves a very small amount of people, and everyone is just contributing to that kind of resource up top. It's almost like feudalism. We've kind of done the full circle, and we're back into feudalism, and everything that we provide, everything we produce, then goes into lying in the pockets of the super rich, the super wealthy. And that, for me, just represents the kind of pinnacle of how unjust this system has become. And that is one thing that we really need to figure out. How do we undo that? How do we make the system work for everyone? And do we have to dismantle the whole thing, which terrifies people? But do we then have to dismantle the whole thing, or do we tweak it? Dismantling is way too radical for so many people. So I think it's going to be a lot of different tweaks. But if you're going to tweak it, then again, we need to understand what is the end result we want out of this system, and how do we design a system that gets us to that end result. And so that's where, again, I'll mention Donella Meadows, the Think in the Systems book is really important, because she helps people to really understand that the output of a system is very much triggered by the inputs. If you can define your outputs in a correct way, then you really are able to work on what the inputs are in order to drive the right behaviors, the right performances, in order to get to the right output. We know what the outputs are that we want, I think, generally. And there is now a growing challenge being put out there, even within the EU. The EU Commission had a couple of sessions a couple of months ago on the issue of degrowth. So how do you turn that into something that isn't just this is a leftist agenda item, but actually something that is universally beneficial for the majority? And how do you get people to understand how they can participate to also contribute to an agenda that actually can be beneficial for them as individuals? So that was a bit long-winded, but...
Long-winded, but incredibly articulate. Well, I'm just thinking about all of that. That's really sparked the conversation. I think what you've pointed out here is that if we were to rewind what's driven the industrialization, the commercialization, the capitalism, all the things that have led us to this point, has been a bit of a gap, almost a chasm between what some people had and other people didn't, right? So the scarcity mindset has driven people to want and crave that which other people have in abundance. And that pattern has just repeated itself. And like you say, it's made a lot of people, and in the minority, but a lot of people own control and have control over most of the wealth that's in the world today. So scarcity has a polarizing effect. Obviously, you get to see what the other side looks like, and therefore you act upon it to make that change possible in some sort of way. And I'm wondering what that driver will now be, because all of a sudden for people to wake up not only to the purpose that they need to now shift to, but to realize what their role is in relation to that, and take personal accountability really for moving away from quite a safe organization or safe set of ideals really that they've been used to and they've grown up with, to something that's a little bit more focused on what should be done, will be a huge step. And I'm wondering who are the people that can really shine the light on that. On this show, we talk about entrepreneurs. We can talk about entrepreneurs. We could talk about thought leaders. We could talk about government, world leaders. Who's going to drive this change?
Kind of has to be everyone. That's the issue. I think for a while, I think people were just relying on, okay, it's going to be Elon Musk. He's come out with electric cars. It's going to be all about electric cars and we'll win. Or it's going to be nuclear energy. Or it's going to be this. It's a combination of everything. You cannot replace a system in which, say, the oil industry has propelled us into this level of development and just say, yeah, we'll just replace oil with something else and then we're done. That's not sufficient. So I think first of all, help you to understand that what we need is a diversity of solutions. And for that diversity of solutions to come to life, we need a diversity of people working on the diversity of solutions to help us move forward. So from business leaders who understand that their business is at risk, existentially at risk from the effects of climate change, to politicians who are willing to stand up to business leaders who want to maintain the status quo. Those are really important drivers of the conversation, because we still have this level of hierarchy that exists. And so those type of people need to talk to each other. But I think what I would like to see more is just everyday people really starting to understand a little bit more about how things affect them. When you look at the basket of goods, when you look at inflation and things like that, people are like, oh, well, inflation's quick. Well, again, when you look deeper into that and you look at the inflation figures, prices are not increasing necessarily because of commodity prices. They're increases because certain businesses have seen an opportunity to increase prices because of the threat of commodity price increases. That is just unjust. Whether it's right or not, theoretically, or I would say practically, it's unjust. Morally, it's unjust. Yeah, it might be fine. It might be a part of the game, but morally, it's unjust. Where is the outrage? And I think we just have a level of apathy that people have reached at the moment because we're unable to connect them to the things that really matter. When I think of the work that you've done from a marketing and advertising perspective, I think there's a massive opportunity there within the advertising sector to help people really understand and connect with their values better, to help people understand that they too can have a role to play, that their world could be better. It could be better if they were to open up to these different ideas. We are very bad from an environmental perspective, whether it's environmental or social, connecting emotionally with audiences that can really make changes. I think as an example, I can say, again, looking at the car industry, there's this idea that we just switch everything to electric cars has taken its own life. If everyone drove an electric car, well, wait a second. That's not the solution. The solution is we switch to electric cars and then we reduce car ownership. So you have access to vehicles, because you don't need to have, no one needs, depending on where you live. But when I look at Europe, for example, you shouldn't need to have a car. Have access to a car, yeah. But then that also looks at fundamental topics of we can decrease the amount of land that is used for parking, which means that we can turn it into grassland, greenland, whatever it is, have open space for kids to play, improve air quality. You can decrease the amount of raw minerals that are required to build whatever millions of cars that you need to build a year, which then has massive implications on the resource-rich countries who, by the way, have not benefited from this whole economic development in a way that they should have done. You can reduce your reliance on certain energy sources because you're not going to be producing so many cars. But for that to happen, we need to be better at telling the narrative of why these things are interconnected, helping people to see that their lives could improve out of these choices that need to be made. We need to be better at that. I think from a social perspective, we have to do the same as well. We have right now the beginnings of a very steep migrant crisis. Whatever it is that we're experiencing now is just the tip of the iceberg. When you look at, I think it was the Tunisian issue with the guy who set himself on fire, that was part of the revolution, but actually that was triggered, according to some reports, on climate change. People's ability to grow food was diminished. Prices rose. That created a massive kind of revolution within that country that spread. People are coming across on boats and treated like shit. If you look at the UK, and I'm sure you and I here are probably agreed in that we feel pretty embarrassed at the moment to see people like Suella Braverman talking about migrants in such a fashion and treat them in such a fashion. But actually, these are people who are leaving really difficult circumstances, partly due to the effects of climate change. And we have an opportunity to be able to tell that story, provide that narrative that can then switch hearts and minds towards how do we actually work to not just reduce our own consumption, our own demands on the ecosystem, but then find ways to encourage our politicians and our businesses to then work on the restoration of ecosystems so that people can stay in their homes and work and provide for themselves. I'm a child of a migrant, so I know fully well that people generally don't choose to leave their homes for shits and giggles. There's usually an economic imperative to do so. I've been lucky enough to be able to choose to move. I chose to move to Brazil. I chose to move to Japan. I've chosen to move to the Netherlands. I've chosen to work in Berlin. These are choices that I've made, fully aware of what's going on. But many of these people don't have these choices, or the choice they have are false choices. And so there's lots of different layers of the conversation that we need to have that we're not having. There's lots of different people we can bring into this conversation that would like to contribute, but don't yet know how to. So the challenge is, how do we then start building the right levels of coalitions? How do we make people angry enough to actually stand up and do what's right, even if it's out of their own self-interest of, I want to have a better life. I want to live in a place where I have better air quality. I want to live in a place where my kids are safe and my house doesn't have a risk of flooding. Even if we can get people to start thinking from that perspective, then we can start, I think, creating a conversation that could then lead to some of the fundamental changes that we need to see.
There is obviously a challenge with all of that. It's harder to make tangible. It's harder to do. It's like in business, anything that feels too strategic or too lofty or a little bit nebulous or idealistic, it feels like a lot of that is often dismissed because it doesn't tangibly translate into something that people can really feel, understand, actively contribute to, or even talk about in the now. I'm wondering where we can look to for examples of how people have brought those conversations together successfully and have delivered the outcomes that the people are looking for, and in a way that they can see. I think there's usually a bit of a split between a short-term focus and a very long-term one. And the very long-termists would come at it from the point of view of transition design. What are you thinking about now? Same in business. You might find that a 5-year plan is a luxury, but actually it really grounds people in what they need to do in the next week or in the next quarter. Even if in 6 months' time it has to be completely rewritten, people need to be given a pathway or a set of clear things to aim at for that to be, in a way, understood and actioned tangibly. So yeah, where do you think we can look to for people? How can people lead this way? How can they converse this way? Where have you seen it working well? Even if it's just on a really minute level, how could that be applied at a broad level as well?
I think first of all, we have to recognize that whatever I say, whatever I put out there, it's never going to be enough. And these are, like you say, these are the beginnings of things, of conversations that we need to have. Because I think there's very much the people who will come and say, what about this, what about that? And we're not there. There are definitely ways that we can improve. But I can think of a couple of examples, both from a political and a business perspective. It's somewhere in Brazil, whether it's Recife or Belo Horizonte or somewhere, where they have participatory democracy, participatory decision-making, in which they've actually used that to help people understand how they can have much more voice from a political perspective and see the results of that voice. So working to improve public transport systems. I believe the same notion is being used in Colombia, parts of Colombia as well, where people become much more engaged politically because they're given the opportunities to contribute directly into decisions that affect them fundamentally. And it gives that voice to people that so often, and maybe it's about taking decisions that from that kind of wider governmental level down to local level and saying, well, what can we do as local politicians to really drive conversations that can get us to the right point and interact better with the communities we serve. From a fashion perspective, there's a couple of things that come to mind. The first is, and unfortunately it's always after a disaster that's happened, but when you look at the Bangladesh Accord, which is now the International Accord, the ability to sit down with different parties, different stakeholders, from brands, from retailers, from local NGOs and other local governments, and work on ways to actually improve the building safety of the factories from which we source. That was also a success because you're looking there at agreements that are made at local level with international support and funding that allows people to live and work in safer buildings that reduce the risk of buildings collapsing. And unfortunately, it took a big kind of incident for that to happen, but it triggered something, and that is something that was recently extended. So it was Bangladesh to begin with. It's been extended, I believe, to Pakistan right now. It's called the International Accord. They want to continue doing that moving forward. So I think that's a really interesting, of a kind of industry-focused topic as well. There are lots of really similarly interesting things going on from a climate perspective when you look at the industry as well. How do we combine and work together as companies to help some of the transition problems that the countries that we source from are going through? So how do we help fund some of the climate change, some of the change in energy mixes that we need to deal with? And this also links back to the legislative piece as well, because when we look at having to report on our climate emissions, on our CO2 emissions, For most companies, most of their CO2 emissions come from their supply chains, deep down in supply chains. If you're not going to decarbonize that part of the supply chain, then you have no chance of actually meeting the targets that we've all set for this 1.5 degree threshold, but actually even your own individual targets as well. So understanding that, having to report on it then means that you need to find ways to put the money to then reduce that impact. And that can be directly through product innovation. It can be directly through the different sourcing methodologies, whatever it might be. But it should help to return an absolute long-term reduction over time. I think those are some of the things that come to mind. But I would also say that going back to the car company example, there's a really interesting thing, which is I think it's BMW and Mercedes have actually formed together a joint venture. And I believe they've created a car sharing company. So they continue to build and sell their own cars, and they will do for as long as they absolutely have to. But they're also hedging their bets because they're seeing actually people can't always have their own car. So how do we then build a ride sharing model that allows us to continue as a business moving forward? It's not always an and or. So it's not always like one or the other. There might also be an and as well. And there's also an opportunity to transition into these conversations. So I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but those are things that come to mind in terms of politically, you could engage better with your community from a local level to see that. And I think that political apathy that you get across, whether it's through the only time that people really get riled up is when, it's Brexit or immigration, and then everyone else, other times people just be quiet. So how can you get people involved at a local level? How can you work with businesses from an international perspective to avoid some of the things that have taken place? And then how do companies then deal with that themselves when they're looking at the landscape? They're looking at this 5-year plan. And some companies may not have a 5-year plan, but they have futurists who sit there and look over the horizon and say, what is coming down the line and how can we prepare for some of that? And if you're a big enough company, you usually have like innovation centers that help you to plan a little bit for that. The oil companies did. And so there's chances there to also see certain changes of behavior as well. And if you're able to then maybe start to expand on some of these topics, you have a chance of really starting to have some fundamental conversations on what's coming down the line. And we're not talking 100 years, Chris. We're talking 5 years. The climate issues that we have and the resulting social issues that we have will continue to accelerate over time. And we do not have 100 years to discuss this. We do not even have 20. We look at 2030 as the goal that the governments have set in terms of change they want to see. We're looking at people looking at 2040, 2050 net zero commitments. But actually, when we look at the impacts and how fast they're coming and how devastating they are, then we don't really have the luxury of time to deal with these topics. Things have to happen pretty much now.
Yeah, I like the idea around decisioning being informed and steered by almost the immediacy of the impact in a way, because a longer term investment in a business sense, a longer term investment might be fruitful, but obviously takes a long time, a lot of processes, people and systems. It just that feels wasteful in a way because you're obviously hoping for a longer term return, but the attention it feels needs to be turned to a more immediate impact, but in a way that's mitigating for a lot of things that you've described. And I think there's encouragement, we've painted a fairly bleak picture in this chat so far, but there's encouragement in the fact that from the examples that you've given, both at a government level, in business, from a practitioner's point of view, all the way down, if you look at every single level of society and our social infrastructure in a way, our community at large has the levels and probably the expertise of the brains to be able to take on some of these challenges and probably stitch a few things together. So in my neck of the woods, I was just workshopping and teaching around building a culture of experimentation earlier in the week, for example. And that's all about how you can quickly understand a problem, but really get into the problem, figure out what the right problem is to solve, and then turn that into an experiment that within 2, 3, 4 hours will lead to a certain outcome or will not lead to a certain outcome. And if you don't like it and then it doesn't give you what you need it to do, then you move on to the next thing. But it's a really shorter way of understanding, without 2 years of investment in R&D, whether something will be worth doing or not. And I think that the immediacy with which we can make these decisions, the decisioning power, not only using techniques like that, but also using data and other inputs will become really important. How do we get the right level of information to be able to decide where to focus? How do you get a balanced view on whether you should take this product to market based on not only, your customers and what you think they want or what the business perceives to need, from a commercial standpoint, but also what is its social impact? What is its long tail in a way? And what are you bringing into the world? And what is your responsibility as the owner of that, the custodian of that, to really make sure that you're doing the right thing? I think a lot of that decisioning will become hopefully a little bit more well thought out. What do you think?
I think so, yeah. When I've had the opportunity to speak to various leaders across the businesses that I've worked in, there was a kind of legacy thing as well. It's like, I want to leave something behind. I want to leave something that I can be proud of. And
there's a lot of legacy in the world, right? there's a lot of baggage that everyone's carrying along every day. But
and then you have the thing of people who have kids, and they're looking out at the things that are going on. Crap, what kind of world do I want to leave for my kids? So it's that, I think, from a personal perspective, is helping things. But the immediacy of some of these challenges is also accelerating the way that people think about this as well. And I will have another positive impact story for you, because you said we're getting far too negative.
Go on.
Now, for example, in India, there's a lot of cotton grown in India for the industry. And what we see is that organic cotton has certain benefits for the ecosystem, but it doesn't have as high a yield as the traditional cotton, which uses a lot of pesticides and insecticides, has a lot of water issues, and cause a lot of problems with water. And so certain companies have now started cutting out the middleman and started going directly to the farmers to say, okay, we're going to get the cotton directly from you. We're going to pay you a premium so you can then actually survive and thrive in your system, in your locality. But more than that, we're also going to try to figure out how can we do some, I can't remember the technical word for it, but they have cotton plants, they grow together with other different plants. So you have different types of crops that if one fails, then the other one can still provide sustenance and income to the local people as well. So there's thinking that is now changing. So it's not just I'm just going to use the traditional models of sourcing my materials. It's, well, if I have direct control over my supply chain, I can then make the right interventions, ask the right questions, get the right data, and build closer relationships with the people that are growing these particular things for me as an organization. So what you have then is the opportunity to have a direct impact on the lives of people way down up the value chain, and then demonstrate that impact directly towards your customer should you choose to do so. So I think that's also an example there of people looking at a problem, thinking, okay, how can I solve this to the benefit of me and my organization? And then doing that work, but then there being a kind of knock-on effect of the local communities as well benefiting from decisions that you make that actually are you as a business trying to reduce your level of risk as much as possible.
Yeah, I love that example. And I'm just thinking that would be a great idea, great initiative, and one that would take a little bit of effort, obviously, in setting all that up, but would just return so much. And I'm also thinking that not everyone in a position of responsibility would feel comfortable carrying the weight of that initiative either. It feels like you would attract some to that, but it would be a minority of people that would feel comfortable in taking it forward. So I'm coming back to, I suppose, where people could be empowered to do something themselves at the level they're at. A lot of the listeners to this show will be earlier in their careers, not in a senior position, looking to rise up the ranks quickly. We're in a position now where we can almost lead and provide guidance and direction, obviously, but for a lot of people, they don't have that. They don't feel like they have that option anyway, just yet. They might be coming up with ideas, but quite quickly, within the constraints of what they're working with, they'll be most likely to be shot down. So what advice would you give to people that have broader ambitions, but feel constrained by the situations that they're in?
I think, first of all, for me, is the idea that every job is potentially a climate or a social job. When you look at the work that you do, there's usually some way or some level of improvement, whether it's in processes or systems or sourcing that you can do. Ask the right questions. Do we know where this product's coming from? And even if it's not from a climate related or social justice related topic, it's just good to know these things, because there are inherent risks in the way that we source a lot of the different things that we source as companies. Regardless of what role that you're in, just being able to ask the questions of, where are my goods coming from? Do we have a risk of like slavery, of sourcing in a place that we shouldn't be sourcing? Do we understand the impacts that we're having through these products? And what are the ways that we can optimize our purchasing methodologies, our sourcing strategies in order to reduce our own risk from a business perspective? If you're able to come in and really use this kind of risk mitigation approach, then you have a much better chance of succeeding and putting things forward than if you come in as a person who's really about, we're going to save the world. People will say, just do that in your own time. Just come to me and help me run my business. So it's the little things of, again, using the fashion industry as an example. If you're designing, how can you design so you leave as little waste behind as possible? Because that will also help you save money for your organization, increase your margins. Where can you source materials from where you have a high level of traceability so that you can demonstrate to your investors, to NGOs, to governments in your reports that you have a good handle on where things are moving? How can you take some of these topics and turn them into interesting advertised and marketing campaigns for your organization to use your creative juices, get them flowing in order to tell honest stories about what you're doing as an organization in order to increase the connection with your customer base. And I say this as someone who understands and has seen the gap between what customers say they want versus what they will actually do, but understanding that we want to see that gap closed. We want to see that closed, and part of the responsibility is on us as people in the organization to find the ways to really connect. It's an opportunity that I think we've missed, but it's an opportunity that if we take and we do it the right way, it can really help galvanize lots and lots of different parts of a business and their customers to come on a journey with you. No one has got it perfect. Nobody's got it right. Even when you look at something like Patagonia and you start looking deeper into some of the things that they don't have it absolutely right, but they're trying. But they're also trying to bring their customers along with them. They're trying to bring the ecosystem with them, and they share the information on what they succeed on and what they don't succeed on. So it's not always going to be a walk in the park. In fact, it very rarely is, but there is always going to be something to be gained. It's always going to be something to be learned, and always a way to kind of improve moving forward.
I mean, there are different dimensions to capital, aren't there, that aren't solely financial in and around social capital. Yeah. Obviously, what can be translated into broader benefit, and how do we readdress our understanding of what net benefit or profit actually means? Because in a lot of cases, these initiatives would be put forward within an organization, with a corporate, for example. Let's say if you're an airline, or even if you're in the auto manufacturer and you're investing a lot in EV because that's where it's going, you're following all the other players in the industry, you're investing a lot in the materials that in fact are very expensive to produce. You're playing it out because there's a commercial reason to do it in terms of market share and so on. But often there's a feeling that profit will outweigh purpose in those situations. If it costs too much to invest in, and coming back to capital and how we frame it, how do you set up those cases? How do you best present the way forward in a way that doesn't lead your senior stakeholders and your leadership team just to say, we can't justify the investment in this? Because it really comes from the top. You have to align to the purpose at the top for it to work, in my experience anyway.
No, it does. The purpose question does come from the top, and you have to take them along the journey with you. The conversations that I was having when I first started 13, 14, 15 years ago, however long it was, are very different from the ones that I'm having now. Maybe because I'm also in a high level position, but connecting with people who are in good position, high level positions then, the conversations are very different. And they're very much about how do we figure out a way to integrate sustainability into the business in a way that makes sense, so that you understand very early on what the necessary trade-offs are going to be. So you can put the guardrails in place to figure out when we need to make a decision. How do we then make that happen so that we're not falling foul of some of the fundamental decisions that we've made with regards to our strategy? So it's really important to bring them along. And I think different companies will do this in different ways. But for me, now in this position that we are with all this new legislation coming in, that's my anchor. That's my anchor. That's the way that I want to use to engage these senior stakeholders to say, hey, I understand where you're coming from. I understand the pressure with regards to your quarterly numbers. I get it. And I know that they're going to have to be trade-offs, but here is the wider picture. Here are the things that we need to show that we're working on. Here are the things that have a fundamental risk for us as a business, but also present us with opportunities that if we can land one or two of them, we don't have to address every single topic, but one or two of them, we have a chance to really make a positive impact, not just in terms of the impact on the ecosystem and the human rights situation, but also in terms of our brand value as well. So I feel that for a very long time, this has been a zero-sum game conversation. It's either you win or lose on sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're trying to do now is, and this is not just me, but I think across the board of people working in this topic, it's how do you find win-wins? How do you use this as a point of differentiation? There are going to be areas where you might be able to take a lead, but there's going to be other areas where you're thinking, you know what? We're going to comply. We're going to follow what legislation says. And that's okay because you don't have the resources to take the lead on everything. But then you've got to be okay with that. And then as an organization, you need to be able to say, you know what? Here are the 1, 2, 3 things that we want to stand out for. Here are the 1, 2, 3 things that we're going to put, and that's it. And as long as you're there, you can be kind of open and honest with that. You can be in a position where you say you're consistent with your approach. You can communicate that internally and externally to different stakeholders. Then I think you're good to go. That for me is one of the things, that consistency of communication, of mindset, that this is something that we can actually take and move forward in a way that adds value to the business and isn't just going to be a continuing conversation that leads us to a zero-sum game conclusion.
And I think, just to build on that point, I think that the equipment and the resources and the possible publicity from any of these changes is much greater than it ever was. The fact that even within an employee experience realm, or where people are very much now aware of their personal brand and what it means within the four walls of their organization, but also more broadly, how they're representing themselves in the world. All of this has been a bit of an education to try and get people up to speed with, how can they use their skills and really apply that more broadly, and how can they make people aware of what they can bring as well. So the point being that if you yourself individually, or as any individual, have the tools by which you can start to rally, start to campaign, you can be activist in your own way. But all of those resources are now much more easy to use than they perhaps once were. You wouldn't need one evangelist or a leader to be able to do it, because actually the democratization of influencer marketing, brand, social tools is all there. You can just take it and run with it and make something of it. And if you wanted to get some support, you can get some support. If you need to fundraise, there are ways to do that. There are ways to campaign for yourself and for a cause that you feel passionately about. So I'm quietly encouraged by that, but I can obviously see that's being used for a lot of other things that are less significant as well. So
no, it's a good direction. But yeah, I think when I look from the kind of brand, kind of corporate perspective, there is that realization that if you want the best talent out there, having a commitment to sustainability works, because people care very deeply about this topic. I remember reading that people are actually resigning from jobs where they feel that, or they don't apply for jobs when companies don't have a good approach to sustainability. It's at that level of importance for people coming into jobs right now. So it's really trying to figure out, okay, so yeah, we've got this fundamental existential issue that we're trying to address, but there are also so many different opportunities that exist if we address it properly on brand value, on the people you bring into the company, the people you retain within an organization, on your ESG scoring, on whatever it might be. And we as brands, as people on this sector, need to figure out, so how do we pick the right things for us, for our sector, for our industry, for our strategy, and then communicate that in a way that helps people to understand why we've done it, what it means, but also why we haven't done the 15,000 other things that we get requested of on a consistent basis. And that is also, we haven't spoken about it, that's also kind of partly the job I have as someone who does stakeholder engagement, is reaching out to those NGOs and to other people and having these conversations to say, you know what, I get what you mean, but we are only, externally we may look absolutely massive, but we are only a relatively small player in the game. So the ability to impact certain things may not be as you wish, but this is what we're trying to do. And we welcome that back and forth, welcome the opportunity to engage with them, because I think having those external perspectives are really important for us to align and stress test the things that we're doing, our approaches, and to just keep us a little bit accountable as well. But it's also important for us to be able to navigate that space and say, hey, we get it. We get that there are problems. We're doing our best to resolve some of the problems. So maybe these are some of the ways that we can start to then address them together as a collective, rather than being antagonistic towards each other and then actually not having any room to provide solutions. So I think that's also a really kind of crucial aspect as well of creating this whole ecosystem through which you have businesses doing what they can, you have individuals doing what they can, you have different collectives doing what they can, and you want there to then be a kind of gradual groundswell of changes that can lead us to a place where people are okay with the way things are going. I don't think everyone's going to be absolutely delighted anytime soon, but if we're at least okay with the progress.
Yeah, and I think a point around transparency and really knowing where you stand in relation to some of those initiatives is also important. You can see it, but if you're not feeling part of it, it's just the same as watching the news or anything else. You feel the distance immediately if you don't really understand what it's aiming at, what they're doing. There's also that point. We talked a bit about self-serving corporations and individuals probably within those corporations. I think there's definitely been an inward focus within a lot of organizations. It's how things have been set up within the competitive market. You obviously have to focus inwards to find your own differentiation. And then, you have your own teams and your formula for taking things out into the world. It feels like that connection to broader society needs to be there, the broader community, like the people and culture, which once was HR, it was just looking after people within those four walls, is actually now thinking, how do I unite people around something? And if it's called people and culture, why not connect it to people and culture more broadly in the world and make it relevant to that and what people are actually needing to aim at now to improve things? I think that would strike a chord that would be worth pursuing, I think, for a lot of people.
Like I said, there are opportunities. And I think we need to look at this as a problem to be solved. And what are the opportunities that we can find to build brand equity, whatever else it might be, in order to address these topics. But I also think it's really important to remember that, going back to the discussion on capital, this hasn't existed forever. And I think people forget that. People forget that the current state, whether you want to call it a neoliberal approach to capitalism, has only been around since the 70s. It's not a long time, about 10 years older than me. So just because it feels like it's been here forever doesn't mean that it has. And if something can change so quickly, because 50 years is a pretty short time in the grand scheme of things. If something can change so quickly for the worst, then surely it can also change relatively quickly for the better as well. And sometimes when we have these conversations, I think people lose that sense of perspective, that idea of, crap, you know what? It's only been 50 years, because it is only 50 years. And so there are lots of ways to maybe galvanize people to get them out of that thing of, oh God, it's been here forever, there's nothing I can do, to say, no, it's cool. 50 years is not a long time, and a lot can change in 5, 6, 7 years. 13 years in this industry, a lot has changed. So for me, it's trying to maintain that level of hope, that naive optimism that I have that we can actually do things to mitigate the worst effects of whatever it is that we're going through, and also see the opportunities to connect better with people, whether they're on this side of the world or whether the people that are in our value chain creating the fundamental components for the products that we all want to use and wear over time.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Christian. Yeah, I want to thank you for your time and obviously for putting a lot of those points and arguments forward so eloquently. And it's just cool to chat it through. There's so much obviously that can be done and that should be done, but even just to capture some of that in a short 1 hour is just awesome. So thank you very much. One thing we do on the show is just to give people the opportunity to provide a way for some of the listeners to get in touch if they want to. Would you be happy for somebody to reach out if they had a question or if they wanted to talk about some of these topics in a bit more depth?
Yeah, sure. They can contact me via LinkedIn. I'm sure you'll put the link up on your website at some point. But yeah, that's going to be the best way to contact me.
Yeah, great. Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much.
I also want to say thank you, Chris, for inviting me on. I've actually listened to quite a few of the podcasts and was fairly intimidated by the group you put together. So hopefully I can stand up tall against all the different characters. But it's been really fun listening to the chats you've had. And thank you very much for having me.
No, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Okay, so that's it for this episode. If you're hearing this message, you've listened all the way to the end, so thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review and share this episode with your friends, team members, leaders, if you think it'll make a difference. After all, we're trying to help you, the entrepreneurs, kick more goals within your organizations. If you have any questions about the things we covered in the show, please email me directly at chris@companyroad.co. I answer all messages, so please don't hesitate to reach out. And to hear about the latest episodes and updates, please head to companyroad.co to subscribe. Tune in next Wednesday for another new episode.